She had learned the language of small movements, the way his eyes widened when a light shifted, the tilt of his head when someone entered, the faint happy tension in his fingers when he liked something. The boy was the millionaire's son, wrapped in a life that on paper looked complete, family dinners scheduled between meetings, tutors, every toy a child could want. What people saw was a polished image. What she saw was a deep, unspoken quiet that lived behind his smile. They had searched for answers. Specialist after specialist handed them tests and charts, while the father booked appointments with the best clinics money could find. She read everything she could find on hearing loss, tried therapies and exercises, and learned to decode her son's world without sound. Some nights, she sat at the doorway and held a small bronze key she had found tucked inside an old trunk, an odd keepsake from a life before the mansion, wrapped with a faded photograph and a single line scribbled on the back. The house moved around them like a careful machine. It smelled of lemon polish and coffee, of suits pressed and curtains washed. He lived in a room filled with new things and old silences, and she learned to make their days into rituals. Morning stretches, afternoon practice, evenings of quiet games that taught attention rather than words. She turned therapy into play and play into promise. On a festival evening, lanterns bobbed like small moons and music spilled down the boulevard. A woman moved through the crowd with quick, sure steps and stopped when she saw the boy. She smiled as if she recognized something in his face and placed a tiny pendant into his hand, then disappeared into the lantern glow. The pendant was worn and warm, its bronze catching the light. The photograph in the trunk had a woman with the same quick eyes. The coincidence felt like a nudge. The next day, she carried the pendant and the key to a tiny antique shop where an old man with ink-stained fingers listened to her story as if it were not the first he had heard. He turned the key over carefully and told her about craftsmen who once made objects that taught the body new ways to feel sound, tools that guided vibrations along bone and skin, learned rhythms that coaxed a nervous system into new habits. He produced a packet of notes, small exercises, tapping patterns, a description of a shell-shaped device that distributed gentle pressure along the jaw. She followed the instructions with a stubbornness that felt like faith. The device they built from seashell and soft cloth looked like a child's toy, but it fit precisely against the ear and the mastoid bone. The exercises were part drumbeat and part lullaby, staccato taps to outline consonants, rolling taps for vowels, warm compresses to invite circulation. She taught the boy the exercises as if they were games. Find the bell, clap the pattern, point when the rhythm changes. The father watched from the threshold at first with skepticism, then with a quiet curiosity that came from seeing even small changes. The tests at the clinic remained clinical. Machines hummed and pulsed and printed out lines that doctors read like weather reports. For a long time, the lines showed silence. Then, slowly, they revealed flickers, tiny nerve responses that had not been there before. Doctors spoke in careful sentences about neural plasticity and rare recoveries, about stimulation and age and timing. They gave cautious hope. At home, progress felt less like a report and more like the sound of a seed cracking open. At first, the changes were tiny. A look that lasted longer when a bicycle rattled past, a laugh that came from surprise rather than the practiced reading of lips, a hand that reached for a vibrating phone. One afternoon, the old piano in the study, which had sat unused, was dragged into the light. He pressed its keys, clumsy and delighted, and the strings responded with a tone that seemed to wake something behind his eyes. She called his name softly across the room and watched him turn, not by reading her mouth, but with an expression that held astonishment like sunlight. They did not rush out to tell the world. Instead, they celebrated by doing ordinary things, letting him sit closer to street performers, attending a small brass band at the park, taking turns humming while making breakfast. They recorded sessions, noting rhythms that worked and those that did not, learning to identify patterns that coaxed certain sounds into meaning. Therapists taught them to shape consonants with taps and vowels with warmth. Musicologists suggested songs whose harmonics matched the boy's new sensitivities. The family learned to make science into everyday ritual. The woman from the festival returned with an unassuming satchel of odd instruments, tiny bells, shells, ringed tools that fit against the collarbone. She taught them to map sound into touch, how the jaw could carry a consonant's sharpness, how a humming low note could vibrate in the chest and translate to meaning. The father, a man who had always counted everything in figures and schedules, began coming to sessions and watched as if learning a new language. He learned to clap in a way that made the boy laugh. He learned to sit in silence and wait. School became another kind of frontier, where once he watched classrooms like someone watching a movie with the sound turned down, he began to catch asides and whisper jokes and the soft cadence of other children's voices. Teachers wrote notes about his increased curiosity. Friends formed over shared hobbies, model trains, comic books, the earnest, small dramas of childhood. The fact that he had been deaf turned into a footnote in his life instead of the whole story. Progress was not linear. There were days of stubborn retreat, moments that felt like 2 steps back after a day of joy. There were tears, private apologies, and arguments that tasted like fear. But there were also small triumphs. The first time he answered from another room, the first time a single clear sentence came out without effort, the first laugh that came purely from surprise. Each tiny victory rearranged the household's gravity. Doctors continued their tests and spoke in tempered tones. This was rare, they said, an unusual adaptation of the nervous system coaxed by stimulation and warmth. They offered explanations that mixed biology with humility. The family, for its part, treated the result as earned rather than miraculous. They gave thanks quietly and kept working. They turned therapy into family ritual. Drills became games. A hidden bell under a cup, a pattern of claps that meant go, a humming song that matched the rhythm of footsteps. These small things stitched the boy's hearing into daily life. He learned to hum his own tunings, private melodies that grew braver each day. Music taught him more than words. It taught him texture and rhythm, the way sound sits in a body. They did not let money make the story shallow. The father used resources to bring specialists and tools, but he also learned a new humility. He volunteered time in simple, practical ways and sat beside his son at practices, learning how to be present. The mother started a small group at a local center, sharing the games and rhythms that had helped them, because she believed a parent's devoted attention could amplify everything professionals recommended. Years folded into a steady routine where the extraordinary was simply life. The boy, who had once navigated by faces and light alone, learned to choose when to listen and when to enjoy silence. He learned to read music and to play clumsy, heartfelt pieces on the old piano. He made friends who loved him for his laughter and his company, not for the story of his past. He learned the gratitude and embarrassment of a child discovering a new ability, the thrill of getting a word right and the sheepish shame of asking twice. The bronze key and the photograph became objects with a quiet place in the house. They were not talismans, but reminders, the key of a trunk, the smile of a woman who had once given him a pendant. They hung in a frame in the hallway so the family could look at them and remember the nights spent tapping rhythms and the mornings of tiny, patient practice. They were bookmarks in a life that had been rewritten slowly, insistently. On the night of a small school play, he stood beneath the stage lights and recited lines he had learned, voice quivering and then finding steadiness. She sat in the audience as her chest tightened in a familiar way at the sound of his words. When the applause came, he looked through the crowd until his eyes found her. She rose and called his name, and the sound was simple and pure, a line between two people who had found each other across a long, quiet distance. They framed the moment not as proof of magic, but as testament to stubbornness. It had been hours of work, rituals repeated until hands remembered, the careful shaping of bodies and rhythms. The woman who had brought the pendant and the shell tools visited now and then, sitting with them and telling stories of others who had rerouted the body one careful step at a time. She spoke of craftsmen who taught bodies to listen and of families who would not give up. They kept showing up, small instruments, quiet songs, a key, and a promise. The boy grew into a man who chose when to listen and when to be still. Sometimes he pressed the bronze key into a child's palm and smiled, passing on a map. They kept the photo to remind them that steady hands could open roads yet. The impossible, they learned, comes from patient, ordinary effort and from the steady work of love.